I never expected a routine knock on my apartment door to make my world spin entirely out of orbit. When I opened it, there she was, Mrs. Everleigh, my landlady, poised and commanding in a way that made the late afternoon sunlight bend around her like a halo. My rent was overdue, and I braced myself for the usual lecture. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled, a knowing, almost mischievous curve of her lips. "You know," she began softly, "there's more than one way to settle a debt." My chest tightened at her words. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the suggestion as absurd, but there was something in her calm, deliberate gaze that rooted me in place. Before I could protest, she continued, "I can forgive your rent if you're willing to try something new, something different." My mind raced, part of me resisting, part of me quietly intrigued. The offer sounded strange, unsettling even, but there was no mockery in her tone, only a strange, persuasive certainty. She beckoned me into the living room, where sunlight spilled across her shelves of books and softly glowing lamps. "You'll start small," she explained, "learning to see yourself as someone else, someone softer, more delicate." I blinked, confused, and a wave of unease passed over me. Her eyes softened, reassuring yet firm. "I'll guide you every step. It won't hurt, I promise, but it will change how you see yourself." I didn't know why, but I nodded. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe the faint thrill of doing something forbidden yet safe. She handed me a hand mirror, and in its reflection, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty, the first hint that I might be stepping into a version of myself I had never acknowledged. My posture stiffened, my hands fidgeted, and yet I was mesmerized. The first instructions were subtle. Straighten your shoulders, soften your gaze, tilt your head slightly. Each adjustment made me feel exposed and oddly graceful at the same time. By the end of that first afternoon, I was exhausted, dizzy with new sensations, and yet there was a strange satisfaction in the tiny progress. I caught my reflection one last time before leaving, and a quiet thought stirred in my mind. Could I really become someone else and like it? The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of anticipation that made my chest both heavy and light at the same time. My mind kept replaying every moment from yesterday, the subtle guidance, the way Mrs. Everleigh's eyes seemed to see not just me, but some hidden version of me I had never acknowledged. I shook off the uneasy flutter in my stomach and tried to focus on mundane thoughts. Breakfast, the day ahead, overdue emails. Yet even as I moved through the motions, her instructions kept replaying in my mind. Tilt your head, soften your gaze, lift your chin. Each subtle adjustment seemed trivial, almost ridiculous on the surface, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were opening a door I didn't even know existed. I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror far longer than necessary. The person looking back wasn't dramatically different, not yet, but there was something new. My face seemed softer somehow, the lines of tension from constant stress and worry slightly eased by a posture I had never practiced before. My fingers lingered over my cheeks, almost unconsciously, as if trying to memorize the shapes, the textures, the faint warmth that made me feel different. By the time I left my apartment to run errands, I realized I was moving differently. My steps were lighter, my hands hovered closer to my body, gestures smaller but more deliberate. It was subtle, imperceptible to anyone else, but to me it felt revolutionary. The world around me seemed sharper, brighter, as if every leaf on the trees and every crack in the sidewalk were part of a stage where I was learning a new performance, one of grace and self-awareness. When I returned later that afternoon, Mrs. Everleigh was waiting with a small stack of outfits. Pastel fabrics, soft textures, delicate lines that seemed designed to accentuate a body I barely recognized as mine. She handed me a light cardigan first, encouraging me to feel the difference in texture, to notice how it shifted the way I carried myself. "It's not about what you wear," she said gently. "It's about how it makes you feel." I slipped it over my shoulders, the soft fabric brushing against my skin in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I caught myself in the mirror again, and for the first time I saw potential, a hint of someone more confident, more fluid, more me. But then doubt struck like a cold wave. Could I really inhabit this version of myself without embarrassment, without judgment? My reflection stared back with tentative curiosity, as though daring me to take the next step. Mrs. Everleigh guided me through small exercises, sitting and standing with elegance, practicing hand gestures, learning to soften my voice slightly. Each instruction was a challenge, a tiny rebellion against the person I had always believed I was. But I began to notice a shift not just physically, but emotionally. The nervous tightness in my chest loosened, replaced with a cautious thrill, a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and terrifying. By the evening, my reflection had changed subtly yet unmistakably. My posture was better, my movements more fluid, my expression softer. I caught myself smiling without realizing it, the curve of my lips hinting at a confidence I had never experienced before. And even as doubt whispered reminders of how ridiculous I must look, part of me, the part that Mrs. Everlie seemed to understand, felt alive, curious, and deeply, urgently interested in discovering where this path might lead. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something unsettling yet undeniable. The transformation wasn't just in my body or my gestures. It had already begun in my mind, quietly, insistently, and I could feel the journey had only just begun. The next morning, the sunlight slanted through my window in thin, golden strips, painting the room with warmth that felt almost too intimate, as if the world itself were conspiring to make me notice every detail of myself. I moved through the motions of my routine, but something had changed. Every mirror, every reflective surface, held a tension I hadn't felt before. A quiet expectation that I would look at myself differently, that I would see not just the familiar, nervous tenant, but something more delicate, more tentative, more me. When Mrs. Everlie appeared that afternoon, she brought with her an array of items, tiny details I hadn't realized could make such a difference. A scarf, soft and pastel, a small brush for my hair, a pair of gloves that fit snugly as if waiting for my hands. "These are for you," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine with that same piercing mixture of gentleness and command. "They aren't just things, they are tools. Tools to help you explore who you are, who you could be." I hesitated, my fingers brushing the materials with a strange reverence. Every texture felt new, every color unfamiliar, yet it was not unwelcome. I wrapped the scarf around my neck, feeling the soft fabric warm against my skin. I brushed my hair slowly, following her instructions, learning to move with care, with awareness. Each gesture was deliberate, taught, and yet somehow instinctive. I found myself looking into her eyes through the mirror, seeking approval, guidance, reassurance. And when she smiled, even slightly, I felt a rush of something I couldn't name. We spent hours that day refining gestures, exploring posture, learning the subtle language of movement. Tilt the head, shift the weight of your body, soften the hands, elongate the spine. Each instruction was a puzzle, a miniature test of patience and self-awareness. At first, my mind balked, irritated by the attention to detail, by the tiny adjustments that felt almost absurd. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. A quiet thrill, a sense of self slowly stretching and reshaping in ways I didn't know were possible. By evening, I caught a glimpse of myself in the full-length mirror. I blinked. The reflection was the same, yet undeniably different. My posture was softer, more fluid. My movements carried a quiet elegance. The lines of tension that had always clung to my shoulders, my jaw, my hands, were easing. And beneath it all, beneath the nervousness and uncertainty, there was a strange, almost secret joy. Still, doubt was never far behind. Could I really keep walking this path without embarrassment, without regret? Could the world accept even the shadow of this new self I was beginning to see? I felt the familiar sting of fear, sharp yet tinged with curiosity. It was a delicate dance between anxiety and exhilaration, and each step felt like I was balancing on the edge of something transformative. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind refused to quiet itself. Every lesson, every gentle correction from Mrs. Everlie replayed vividly. I could almost feel her hands guiding me again, shaping my posture, nudging me toward a version of myself I had never known existed. And as I drifted into sleep, the thought whispered quietly in my mind, "I am changing. I am becoming someone new, and I don't want to turn back." The next week passed in a strange blur, the kind of days that feels stretched and compressed at the same time, where every moment carries weight and meaning beyond its apparent simplicity. I began noticing things in myself I had never really acknowledged before. The way my shoulders slumped without effort, the slight tension in my jaw, the restless movement of my fingers whenever I was nervous. Mrs. Everlie seemed to notice all of it too, and she used it as both lesson and mirror. Each correction she offered was subtle, never harsh, but it carried an authority that made me stop in my tracks and reconsider everything I thought I knew about myself. One afternoon, she set a small challenge before me. "I want you to practice sitting," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "But not just sitting. Sit with intention, with grace, with awareness of every movement your body makes." At first, it felt absurd. Sitting, how could something so mundane carry significance? But as I focused, I realized that even this ordinary act could be transformed into something entirely different, something reflective, almost meditative. I moved my legs carefully, crossed and uncrossed them, rolled my shoulders back slowly, lifted my chin gently, all under her watchful, approving gaze. The mirror in her apartment became both a friend and a tormentor. Each reflection challenged me, revealing imperfections, uncertainties, and tiny glimpses of someone I was only beginning to recognize. My expression softened, my gestures grew deliberate, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, my reflection started to feel like it belonged to someone else. Not completely, not yet, but enough to make my heart beat faster and my stomach twist in anticipation and fear. I caught myself laughing quietly at one point, the sound strange to my own ears. "Is this me?" I whispered to the mirror, and the reflection seemed to smile back, almost knowingly. I felt a strange blend of pride and embarrassment, exhilaration and terror. How could such small changes feel so monumental? How could tilting my head differently, softening my hands, or adjusting my posture carry the weight of an entirely new identity? Mrs. Everlie didn't just teach me to move differently, she taught me to feel differently. The lessons seeped into my mind, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice shifts in my own perception. I felt my nervousness give way to anticipation, my self-doubt to curiosity, my hesitation to cautious confidence. And yet, fear never fully disappeared. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining people noticing the slightest change in my demeanor, my appearance, and I shivered at the thought of their judgment. One evening, she brought out a pastel blouse, soft and flowing, designed to feel gentle against the skin. "Try it on," she instructed, "and don't just put it on. Wear it, move in it, learn its rhythm, its weight, its texture." My hands trembled as I slipped it over my shoulders, feeling the fabric brush against my skin in a way that was both soothing and alien. The blouse seemed to guide my movements, encouraging my body to respond differently, to sit taller, to move more fluidly. As I adjusted to the sensation, I caught my reflection again. For the first time, I felt the faintest glimmer of pride. It wasn't just about clothing or posture or gestures. It was about being. The reflection staring back wasn't fully unfamiliar, but it was different enough to make my chest tighten with a combination of fear, excitement, and curiosity. Who was this person? Who could I become if I allowed myself to fully inhabit this version of me? By the time I left her apartment that night, the city streets seemed sharper, louder, more vivid. Every sound, every movement of people around me carried a heightened awareness, as if the world itself were attuned to my transformation. I realized that even as I feared exposure, I also craved the chance to explore this new self. There was a tension inside me, a pull between caution and desire, anxiety and exhilaration, that refused to let me remain static. I was changing. I was learning. I was becoming someone I had never dared to imagine, and the thought both thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a subtle but undeniable shift in my identity. Not a dramatic one, not yet, but a quiet undercurrent pulling me toward a self I had never dared acknowledge. The reflection in the mirror, the gestures, the fabric brushing against my skin, all of it whispered a single, insistent truth. I was no longer entirely the person I had been. And deep inside, a small, trembling part of me realized that I didn't want to turn back. The following days unfolded in a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm, as if my life had been rewritten in a language I only partially understood. Every step I took, every gesture I made, felt charged with significance. I began noticing details I had never truly seen before. The way the light fell across the wooden floorboards, the quiet hum of the city outside my window, the faint scent of Mrs. Everlie's perfume lingering in her apartment long after I left. Each sensory moment seemed amplified, resonating with a heightened awareness I couldn't explain, but that I could not ignore. Mrs. Everleigh's guidance became more intricate, almost surgical in its precision. She asked me to move in ways that initially felt unnatural, to hold myself differently, to inhabit my own body as if it were a delicate instrument requiring practice and mindfulness. "Every movement," she told me one afternoon, "tells a story, and the story you tell yourself is just as important as the one others see." I didn't fully understand it at first, but the truth of it settled slowly into my consciousness, pressing gently but insistently at the edges of my mind. We began with posture, hours spent perfecting the subtle shifts of shoulders, hips, and spine. She guided me in small, deliberate motions, crossing my legs with intention, tilting my head just so, holding my hands lightly at my sides. Each adjustment felt trivial at first, almost laughable, but I began to notice subtle changes in how I perceived myself. The reflection in the mirror no longer seemed like a stranger. It was the same face, but one that carried an unfamiliar, quiet confidence. The tension in my jaw loosened, my shoulders fell naturally, my chest rose with the subtle rhythm of self-assurance. And yet, beneath all this emerging poise, doubt clawed persistently at me. Could I really walk the streets like this? Could I inhabit this new self without fear, without embarrassment, without shame? I caught myself in reflective surfaces throughout the day, store windows, mirrors in elevators, polished tabletops, and each time a jolt of anxiety ran through me. I would study my posture, my movements, the delicate tilt of my head, and wonder if it was believable, if it was right. The self-consciousness was exhausting, yet strangely intoxicating. One afternoon, she introduced the next step, clothing that spoke softly but clearly of a feminine identity I had never truly explored. A flowing skirt, a blouse of soft pastel, delicate shoes that encouraged me to walk differently. "Clothes aren't just fabric," she explained. "They are extensions of the self. They give form to who you are or who you are becoming." I hesitated, running my fingers over the textures, the stitching, the weight of the fabric. A strange thrill ran through me, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something I could barely name, anticipation. Slipping the clothing over my body, I felt an immediate, subtle change. It was not overt, not shocking, but internal, a shift in posture, in gait, in the way I held my hands. Every tiny movement became a statement. When I looked into the mirror afterward, I hardly recognized myself. Not in the sense of identity theft, but in the way someone might recognize a familiar face subtly transformed by light, mood, and expression. It was me, yet not fully me, tentative, evolving, awakening. Social encounters, however, became new sources of anxiety and revelation. A brief walk to the nearby cafe turned into an exercise in self-awareness. Each glance from a passerby, each stray comment from a barista, triggered a whirlpool of self-consciousness and introspection. I realized how closely I scrutinized myself in every interaction, how acutely aware I was of my posture, my gestures, my voice. It was exhausting, and yet, paradoxically, empowering. Each successful small interaction, each moment I didn't flinch at a stray glance, added a tiny shard of confidence to the fragile mosaic I was building. Even at home, in the quiet hours when the city hummed faintly outside, my mind refused to settle. I would catch myself practicing gestures in the mirror, moving my hands, tilting my head, studying the way my shoulders shifted with each breath. The reflection stared back patiently, expectant, a silent mentor demanding nothing but presence and honesty. And each night, I fell into bed drained but exhilarated, the residue of my days lingering in my muscles, in my posture, in the quiet pulse of identity reconfiguring itself from the inside out. Mrs. Everleigh's influence was subtle yet pervasive. She never forced, never judged. She guided, observed, encouraged, and occasionally tested me, but always with that calm, magnetic presence that made resistance feel futile. Each correction, each suggestion, became a whisper into my subconscious, reshaping not just my gestures but the way I felt about my own body. For the first time, I began to imagine a self I had never allowed myself to contemplate. Someone softer, more aware, more in tune with subtle expression and grace. By the end of that week, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The transformation was no longer external. It had seeped into my mind, my perception, my very sense of self. I wasn't just wearing different clothes or adjusting my posture. I was learning to inhabit a body and a presence that felt more aligned with a truth I had long ignored. And the thought was both thrilling and frightening. I am changing. I am becoming someone I have never been. And I cannot unsee this version of myself. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and tracing the shadows that shifted with the city lights, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation and the ache of uncertainty intertwine. My reflection, my gestures, my awareness, everything had shifted. And deep within me, a small, insistent voice whispered, "This is only the beginning. There is no turning back now." The following days blurred into a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign, a strange mixture of routine and revelation. Every moment seemed infused with subtle lessons, each interaction a reflection of the self I was slowly learning to inhabit. When I left my apartment, I noticed the world in ways I hadn't before. The soft curve of tree branches swaying in the breeze, the play of sunlight across window panes, the faint smiles of strangers passing by. Each observation felt magnified, as if my senses themselves were recalibrating to notice the subtleties of movement, tone, and presence. Mrs. Everleigh's guidance intensified. She introduced me to new gestures and postures that challenged my previous notions of my body. "It's not about perfection," she said one afternoon, her voice calm and persuasive. "It's about awareness, about inhabiting yourself fully, noticing the details, embracing the subtlety." She asked me to practice walking, sitting, even standing in ways that initially felt unnatural. Slight twists of the torso, deliberate placement of hands, gentle shifts in weight that seemed trivial but transformed the way I perceived myself. At first, I stumbled through each exercise, my movements clumsy, self-conscious. Mirrors became my constant companions, reflecting both progress and imperfection. But gradually, each adjustment became more instinctive. The reflection staring back at me was no longer a stranger. My posture softened, my gestures acquired a new fluidity, my expressions hinted at emotions I had rarely allowed myself to feel openly. There was elegance emerging where I had expected awkwardness, subtlety emerging where I had assumed rigidity. The internal shift was even more profound than the external. I began to notice how my thoughts and self-perceptions were changing, almost imperceptibly at first. Doubt still lingered, whispering reminders of embarrassment and judgment. Yet alongside it was a quiet thrill, a sense of liberation, curiosity, and anticipation that made me examine myself more deeply, more honestly, than I ever had before. I found myself asking questions I had never considered. Who am I really? What if this version of me, soft and aware, is closer to who I should be? One evening, Mrs. Everleigh brought a new set of clothes, a flowing dress, soft fabrics in muted pastel shades, delicate textures that felt alive against my skin. "This isn't about wearing a costume," she said, guiding me gently. "This is about inhabiting a presence that feels truthful, that aligns with your growing awareness of yourself." I hesitated, unsure if I could truly embody the look she envisioned. But as I carefully dressed, feeling the fabric brush against my shoulders, my arms, my back, I realized something extraordinary. My body responded instinctively, subtly shifting posture, gestures, and gait to complement the clothing. In front of the mirror, I studied myself in detail. My reflection was still recognizably me, but softer, more fluid, more deliberate. My movements carried an unspoken confidence, a silent grace that seemed to radiate from every gesture. And yet, as thrilling as it felt, it also terrified me. How much of this self was authentic, and how much was an elaborate performance guided by Mrs. Everleigh? Could I maintain this presence outside her watchful eyes, in the unpredictable gaze of the world? Even social encounters became exercises in discovery. A brief trip to the corner cafe revealed how acutely aware I had become of every nuance, how my posture influenced perception, how subtle shifts in expression altered interactions, how even small gestures spoke volumes. At first, anxiety tightened my chest with every glance or comment from strangers. But gradually, a cautious confidence emerged, small but undeniable, as I realized that inhabiting this new self didn't make me weak. It made me aware, deliberate, alive. That night, alone in my apartment, I found myself reflecting on the transformation not just of my body, but of my inner world. The lessons, the guidance, the subtle shifts in movement and presence, they had seeped into my consciousness, reshaping the way I perceived myself. I felt a quiet thrill, tinged with fear, curiosity, and longing. A part of me was exhilarated by the unfolding change, and another part trembled at the uncertainty of what it would mean to continue along this path. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I realized that the transformation was no longer something I could separate from my identity. It wasn't just posture, clothing, or gesture. It was a subtle reorientation of self, a slow unveiling of a part of me I had long ignored. And deep in my heart, a small, persistent voice whispered, "This is only the beginning. There is no turning back now." The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Each morning, I awoke with a strange tension, equal parts anticipation, fear, and curiosity, as if my body and mind were already halfway through a transformation I had yet to fully comprehend. Even the sunlight streaming through my window seemed charged with expectation, illuminating details I had never noticed. The gentle curve of a lampshade, the texture of my blanket, the way my own hands rested on my knees. The world had sharpened, subtly reframed, and I realized that I was seeing not just with my eyes, but with a heightened awareness of every movement, every gesture, every nuance of posture and expression. Mrs. Everleigh's presence continued to shape this new awareness. She guided me with quiet precision, her voice soft but authoritative, each word measured, each instruction layered with meaning. "Movement is language," she said one afternoon, as sunlight dappled across her living room. "Every gesture tells a story about who you are or who you are becoming. Pay attention always, even the smallest shift matters." I nodded, absorbing her words like a student desperate to learn, though part of me trembled with anxiety at the sheer weight of it all. That week, she pushed me further than ever before. We spent hours refining every subtle motion. How I lifted my hands, the angle of my shoulders, the way I tilted my head, even the cadence of my breathing. At first, the exercises felt absurd, almost comical. Sitting with deliberate poise, walking in measured steps, adjusting the placement of my fingers with an almost obsessive precision. I thought I would fail or worse, embarrass myself. But slowly, something remarkable happened. My body began to internalize these lessons. Movements that once felt foreign became instinctive. Gestures I had struggled to perform now flowed naturally, as if they had always belonged to me. Clothing became an even more powerful tool. Mrs. Everleigh introduced me to fabrics and styles I had never dared imagine wearing. Soft pastels, flowing skirts, delicate blouses, shoes that encouraged a different posture and gait. "The clothing is only the beginning," she said. "It's the vessel for discovery." I slipped into a flowing dress one afternoon, the fabric brushing against my arms and back in a sensation both thrilling and terrifying. Standing in front of the mirror, I was struck by the way my body responded almost instinctively, how my posture adjusted, how my hands softened, how my movements carried a subtle elegance I had never known. But the transformation was not just external. It crept into my mind in ways I could neither control nor ignore. I found myself questioning everything I had assumed about myself. Who was I beneath the surface I had always presented to the world? Was this new, delicate, aware version of me closer to the person I had always longed to be but never dared admit existed? Every glance in the mirror, every subtle adjustment, every corrective suggestion from Mrs. Everleigh pushed me further along a path I could not yet fully articulate. Social interactions became exercises in heightened awareness and inner conflict. A simple walk to the local market felt like stepping onto a stage. Every glance, every comment from strangers, triggered a complex cascade of thoughts: self-consciousness, pride, fear, exhilaration. I noticed how my posture and gestures influenced how people perceived me, how the slightest tilt of my head or shift of my shoulders seemed to carry a subtle narrative. Some reactions startled me, others emboldened me. I was learning, often painfully, that my external self was now intimately tied to how I felt inside, and that each successful step of confidence was a small but profound victory. There were nights when doubt clawed at me relentlessly. Alone in my apartment, I would practice gestures in front of the mirror, silently asking, "Am I fooling myself? Is this who I truly am, or just a reflection of someone else's influence?" The questions were endless, each one deepening the tension inside me. Yet with each practice, each adjustment, I discovered something even more compelling. A quiet, stubborn joy at the subtle mastery of my own movements, an exhilaration at inhabiting a body and presence I had once dismissed or ignored. Mrs. Everleigh's lessons also began to push me emotionally. She asked me to explore expressions I had never allowed myself: subtle smiles, quiet confidence, openness in posture, gestures that invited engagement rather than avoidance. At first, I stumbled through them, awkward and hesitant. But gradually, I began to feel the power in subtlety, the thrill of small mastery, the deep satisfaction of aligning my inner self with my outward expression. The reflection staring back at me was still me, yet undeniably changed, more aware, more deliberate, more alive. By the end of one particularly long afternoon, after hours of movement, posture, and clothing exercises, I found myself standing in front of the full-length mirror, utterly exhausted yet exhilarated. I studied my reflection with meticulous care. My shoulders were relaxed but strong, my hands soft and deliberate, my movements fluid. Even the tilt of my chin, the curve of my smile, carried an unfamiliar grace that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And for the first time, I recognized that I was no longer just following instructions. I was inhabiting my own transformation, shaping it, embracing it. The city outside my window seemed different that night, more vivid, more alive. The lights, the distant sounds, the movement of people, they all resonated with a heightened intensity, as if the world itself were responding to the subtle shifts in me. I realized that my transformation was no longer merely a private experiment. It had permeated my mind, my identity, my very perception of reality. I had become hyper-aware of myself, yet more attuned to the world, more present, more alive. And yet, as exhilarating as it was, fear lingered. The questions remained. Could I sustain this self outside the safe guidance of Mrs. Everleigh? Would the world accept this version of me, or would my own insecurities sabotage everything I had begun to build? The tension was almost unbearable, a constant pull between anticipation and anxiety. As I lay in bed that night, tracing the shadows cast by the city lights, I felt the full weight of my transformation. Not just the physical changes, the clothing, the gestures, but the profound, inescapable shift in identity, perception, and self-awareness. The reflection in the mirror, the careful postures, the deliberate movements, they had become more than lessons. They were revelations, intimate guides toward a self I had never dared to admit could exist. And deep within, a quiet, insistent truth whispered, "You are no longer who you were. You are becoming someone extraordinary, and there is no turning back." The morning light filtered through my apartment window with a softness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the world itself knew today was different. I woke slowly, aware immediately of the strange, persistent hum of anticipation running through my body. It was not just the physical echo of the long days spent under Mrs. Everleigh's guidance, but the mental, emotional resonance of a transformation that had crept into every corner of my being. Every movement, every posture, every gesture had become part of a rhythm I now instinctively followed. My body felt both unfamiliar and intimately mine, a strange and exhilarating duality that left me simultaneously confident and fragile. I rose and stood before my bedroom mirror, taking in the reflection that had become a companion, a mentor, and sometimes a silent judge. For hours over the past weeks, I had practiced, adjusted, and refined every nuance of posture, gesture, and expression. Yet today felt like the culmination, the moment when all the fragments of subtle learning, tiny victories, and tentative experiments coalesced into something tangible, undeniable. I studied my reflection with meticulous attention. My shoulders were relaxed but intentional, my spine elongated in a natural grace. My hands rested lightly with soft awareness, and the tilt of my head carried the delicate authority of someone fully inhabiting themselves. The clothing I chose this morning, a flowing blouse and a skirt of muted pastel, soft textures that brushed against my skin, was more than fabric. It was an extension of the self I had painstakingly discovered. As I moved in it, I felt the seamless integration of external and internal identity. Every step carried a fluidity that was at once deliberate and effortless. I twirled lightly, almost imperceptibly, feeling the fabric shift and catch in ways that accentuated movement I hadn't realized I had mastered. A small, private smile crept onto my face, a silent acknowledgement of how far I had come, and a whisper of pride mingled with disbelief. But the triumph was tempered by the lingering tension that had shadowed me throughout this journey. Social interactions, the judgment of others, the unpredictable world outside the safety of Mrs. Everleigh's guidance, all of it loomed in my mind like a distant storm. Yet, unlike before, I felt prepared. I had internalized the lessons in subtlety, awareness, and presence. I knew that the world might glance, comment, or question, but I had developed the quiet confidence to respond not with fear, but with composure, curiosity, and even a gentle delight in the narrative I now embodied. That afternoon, Mrs. Everleigh arrived with her usual calm presence, yet there was a slight, almost imperceptible glint of pride in her eyes. "Today," she said, her voice soft yet insistent, "you will fully inhabit the self you've been discovering. Not just in posture, not just in clothing, not just in gestures, but in presence. Every action, every thought, every reflection, fully you." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing gently against my chest. I was nervous, of course, my mind a tangle of self-doubt, fear, and anticipation. But beneath it all was a strange thrill. The kind that comes when you stand at the edge of something transformative, something irreversible, and realize that you have no choice but to step forward. The exercises that followed were subtle yet exhaustive. We practiced walking, sitting, and even the quiet gestures of everyday life. The way I poured tea, held a book, gestured during conversation. Every motion was analyzed, refined, and then internalized until it became instinctive. The mirrors in her apartment reflected not just my body but the evolution of identity itself. I began noticing the faint, almost imperceptible confidence that had grown in my expression, the gentle authority in my posture, the quiet joy in gestures that once felt forced or awkward. By evening, I was exhausted, yet exhilarated beyond measure. I stepped outside into the streets that had once intimidated me and experienced them anew. The world felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I walked with awareness, with poise, with a deliberate confidence that made even strangers' glances feel less like judgment and more like acknowledgement of presence. Each interaction became an exercise in subtlety and control, a reflection of the inner transformation that had been slowly unfolding over weeks. And then, in a quiet moment, I realized something profound. The transformation was no longer something I did under instruction or observation. It had become intrinsic. My gestures, my posture, my awareness, my very sense of self, each had merged into a coherent whole, a self that was delicate yet assured, aware yet free, evolving yet complete. The mirror no longer reflected a before and after. It reflected me, fully, unmistakably, unapologetically. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I paused by the window and looked out over the city lights. The soft glow illuminated the streets, the trees, the distant hum of life, and I realized that the transformation was more than physical or social. It was existential. I had learned to inhabit myself fully, to align body, mind, and perception, to embrace subtlety, grace, and awareness in ways I had never imagined possible. And in that realization, I felt a quiet, thrilling freedom. The knowledge that I was no longer bound by the self I had known, but had become someone entirely new, someone honest, deliberate, and alive. Lying in bed that night, tracing the shadows that danced across my ceiling, I felt the full depth of change resonate through me. The journey had been long, often challenging, sometimes exhausting, but it had led to a revelation that was undeniable. I was no longer the hesitant, unsure person who had answered the knock on Mrs. Everleigh's door weeks ago. I had grown, evolved, and discovered a self I had never dared to imagine. And the quiet, unwavering truth settled within me like a heartbeat. This is who I am now, fully, unapologetically, and without regret. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at home in my own skin.